So today we're going to be talking about React hooks. Maybe we can start this with, has anyone heard about hooks before? Who knows about hooks? Raise your hand if you heard about hooks before. The name? That's fine. If you even heard it, just like let me know. Raise your hand if you've ever used hooks in any way. Great. So the ones who heard about hooks and haven't used it, how would you describe what hooks are, or what do you know about it? It can be nothing or just the name, but what do you know so far? Cool, you're in the right place. I have work to do. So this is our roadmap for today. I'm going to be looking at what are hooks. So that's a great first thing to look at because we want that. Then the motivation. So I'm going to be looking at why did the React team choose to add hooks to React. Right? The React team is very, very, very good at coding, right? And every time they make a decision of something they want to add or remove, they don't take it lightly. There's a lot of thought behind it. So what motivated them to actually use hooks? We're going to look at a couple of hooks that come with React. We don't even know what they are yet, but it will make sense when we get there. Some rules when we are writing hooks, because we'll be building our own hooks as well. And finally, what can you do? Where can you take it from here to get better at hooks? So let's start with what are hooks, so we can get that out of the way. So hooks are a new addition to React 16.8. This literally came out half a month ago, I think, a couple of weeks ago. So it's very, very new, but it was available in the alpha version of React, the unstable one, for a couple of months now. So we've all been playing, like the dev world has been playing with hooks for a while and really excited about it, but it's only just become an actual feature of React. And what they allow you to do is they allow functional components to do everything that class components can do now. Right? So up until now, if you've ever used React, one of the things we teach, especially here, we say, start out with a function. And functions cannot have any state. They cannot have any lifecycle methods, right? So they're very simple. Functions are literally props in, HTML out. They're presentational. And if you want to add state, or if you want to add some more logic, well, you need to turn this into a class and you need to start writing some extra class stuff. You need to start using the this keyword here and set state and a lot of other things. Well, hooks are a way to sort of never having to do that if you don't want to. So from now on, functions will also have the ability to use state and to use lifecycle events methods. It's quite interesting. So basically, the motivation behind this is that right now, reusing logic across components is hard, and we will see a very good example of this later on. So when you have a component with state and some logic you want to reuse, well, you have to like copy paste code. It's not easy to share the logic to other components, for example. That's quite hard. Complex components become really hard to understand. So if you have classes with lots of methods and you have to do this dot state, this dot props, it becomes hard. You have to know how to bind functions or how to use arrow functions, and it's just a lot to learn. And finally, classes confuse machines and they confuse people. I'm sure you've all had issues if you use React in which you're trying to pass a function down, but you forgot to bind it, so then this is not what you think it was and it fails, and there's just a lot of complexity there, right? So these are the reasons why the React team thought we need to come up with something that will make all of this better. And if you want to find more info, I will share the link to this presentation later on, and you have access to it there. So, without further ado, I'm going to start looking at what it actually means to use hooks. UseState is a hook that comes with React. And UseState, like the name says, it allows a functional component to have some state. The way to use it is quite simple. So you have a functional component, which is, remember, it takes props and it gives you HTML. Well, now, in between, before you return something, you could call UseState and pass an initial value that you want to have. And then there's some funky syntax here on the left. Have you seen that before? This is called destructuring, right? And in particular, is array destructuring. So usually destructuring, you see it with curly braces when we're destructuring objects. Well, here we're destructuring an array, because what's happening is useState takes this initial state and it gives you back an array, and the first element of that array is a getter, so to get the value, and the second item is a setter, to set a new value. So we get a getter and a setter, and this way what we're doing is we're creating a getter, which is literally our value, and a setter, which is a function that we can call to set a new value. Right? So destruction makes it quite easy to do it in like a single line in an elegant way. So if you want to follow along, I'm going to be using that link over there, and we're going to be doing a little bit of live coding now to show you how this works in practice. So I'll give you a minute if you want to follow the link, and then we get started. It's fairly easy. I tried to create bit.ly links with very logical names. So bit.ly/hooks-counter. So let's get to it. And this is basically what we're going to be building. And in this case, I've already built it using classes. So this is a valid React component. It's app, and it's literally a counter. It goes down, and it goes up when you click on things. Nothing special about it. It's just an H1, 2 buttons, some state. So the state I have in this application is literally just a counter, right? So counter, if you think about it, I don't know if you ever thought about it this way, but this 0 is the initial value, right? So counter starts at 0. I could start at 100, I could do whatever, but it makes sense for my counter to begin at 0. And then I have two methods, one to increase the counter. So to increase the counter in a class component, I need to do this .setState and put the new counter in there, which is the counter plus 1. And to make it go down, same thing, but minus 1. Right, so nothing special. If you haven't seen React before, this might be a little new. But this is how React worked almost since the inception until today, right? So hooks are a feature of functions. So the first thing I need to do is turn this whole thing into a function. Right? So I don't want a class anymore. I still want to use state, but I don't like classes, so I'm going to change this. I'm going to say const app equal. Remember, the functions are, so like functional components are literally just functions that take props and return some HTML. So by doing this, I don't need a render anymore. I just need a return. So this is almost working already, but I cannot use any of this right now. All right, so I'm going to comment this out for a minute. And, well, we don't know what we're going to put in there yet. Right, so none of this will exist. And you can see it's working. Obviously, nothing's happening now because I don't have a click event or anything. But the page is working, it's rendering. So we successfully turned this into a functional component now. Before, you were kind of locked. At this moment, it's like, I want state. Okay, I need to turn it back into a class. Now what we're going to do instead is we're going to be importing useState. Right? So we don't have to create useState. React provides that for us, so we need to import it this way. And I'm going to use it exactly the same way that I'm showing you here, right? So useState with my initial value, and it will give me a getter and a setter. So let's get to it. I can say counter and set counter, right? So this is going to be my counter value. This is going to be my setter for it. And useState 0. My initial value will be 0. And now I can grab my counter, I can put it there. Much easier than doing this .state.counter, right? I don't need to destructure that anymore. So it becomes quite simpler. And my setter function, I could potentially just create a little function here that says set counter to counter -1. Ta-da! I could do the same here. And we have exactly the same functionality as before. Only this time, it's actually much shorter as well, right? And if you wanted to, if you don't like creating these functions here because you think it's messy, you could always just put them outside. And you could say, I'm going to create a function, because remember now we're in a function. We're inside the function body, so we can create constants, we can create functions, we can do whatever we want. We're literally just inside a function. So I'm creating a new function called up that's going to set my counter to go +1, and another one called down that will lower the counter. And because these functions don't take any arguments, I can literally just pass them like this. Still works. So other than that takes a little bit to get used to it, right? It's a little bit alien at first. But who thinks this is cleaner than what we had before? Raise your hand. Cool.
For every variable you want to have in state, you need to probably use state once.
Exactly. So if I wanted to have, so right now what we are simulating is in a class component, right? We would have like counter 0. If we wanted to add a new thing like say to-dos and an empty array, well, I just need to call this again with an empty array, and this is going to be to-dos set to-dos, right?
Why did 0?
Sorry?
Why did 0?
Because that's my initial value.
Oh, right, okay. Oh, is that what it is?
Right? Counter, the initial value 0, 0. To-dos, initial value is an empty array, empty array. Yep. Any questions before I move on? You enjoying it? So set counter is the equivalent of when I was doing this.setState before, right? Only this is a very specific function that whatever I pass to it will change this counter here.
So it's just like this.setState, take counter.
It's essentially doing this.setState, taking counter, but it's doing that for us, basically. So we have a getter and a setter. So each piece of state now has its own setter and its own getter, right? So it becomes more atomic. We don't have to change the whole state. We change little pieces of it. No. So this is just like anything else, right? So if you wanted to, you could turn your initial state to an object, and you can now change it. In fact, we will be doing a to-do example in a minute.
Basically, if you go past the first level, you still need to spread things, right? To maintain.
Yeah, of course. So the setter will set the whole object. So if you're trying to do something nested, you can still spread. You can do whatever you were doing before. But it's going to be easier, right? Because say you have an object, and now you can do. You can spread the counter and then something else. Cool. Just wanted to give you a minute to just let this sink in. Like very, very little code. It's doing the same as before. I could just call this a day. I have a counter with no classes. That's cool. There's nothing wrong with classes, but there is some extra complexity in classes, right? But there's something we haven't seen yet. So this replaces state, and that's great. But how do I do lifecycle hooks? How do I do something only when the app starts? how do I do something when I unmount a component, right? So how do I do things when a component updates? Well, we don't know how to do that yet. We don't have that power. So we cannot do component did mount, component will unmount. We cannot do any of those things. So to do that, we have another hook. So this is another built-in hook that React wrote for us. And this one's called use effect. And this will sort of challenge the way you think about lifecycle hooks. Right? So right now you were trained to think in terms of the life of the hook. What happens at the beginning, what happens at the end, what happens when you update. So you have very explicit methods for this, right? Use effect can actually do all of those things combined. So it's going to be slightly even more alien at first. But it will make sense, hopefully towards the end of this talk. The way to use effect is, again, you need to import it from React. And unlike the other one, this is just something you can call anywhere in your code. You don't need to keep the value. There's no value that comes back, so you can just call it without storing any variable or anything. No destructuring needed. But it takes two arguments. The first argument is a function, and it's basically like a callback function. This is the function that you want to run. So what is the effect that you want to do? What code do you want to put? So whatever you're trying to do, say you want to fetch something, or you want to update maybe the title of the page, or anything you want to do, you put it there. And then here, the second argument is optional, and it's a list. That's why it's an array. It's a list of the dependencies of this effect. And by dependencies, I mean, let's say that I put a 0 in here, or I put a counter. The counter is at 0. Well, if when my app re-renders, this counter is still at 0, this won't run. But if, and only if this changes, so whatever's inside there changes in value, then the effect will run again. So by dependencies, I mean, if something here changed, rerun the effect. If that's the same as before, don't run the effect again. Yeah? It's a bit confusing, but it'll make sense in a minute. But I just want to get you thinking about that. So, again, if you want to follow along, that's the bit.ly. So this is another project. It's a little bit more full-featured. So bit.ly/hooks.todo. Yep. No worries. So this is a very simple app. It has a bit of CSS. Vasil would be proud. I can type something here. I have to-dos. When I click them, I can complete them, uncomplete them. If I double click on them, I can delete them. So I just created a very, very simple to-do app, right? There's a double click event.
Oh, I didn't know.
So let's take a look at how this works, right? So again, this is done with classes, right? And I have some state, and I have a little method I called add_to_do. So all it's doing is taking a new to-do from the info in state. So, well, actually there's no info in state. It takes the title of my new to-do, creates a new object. UUID is basically generating unique IDs. If you've never seen that before, it just generates this long string of AB, 1, 2, 4, like random numbers. I did that so I make sure that every to-do has a unique ID, otherwise they will clash. Remember, you get this error message saying like every child needs to have a unique key. So I was trying to please React. But that's not important. Important is we get the title, and I'm also saying completed false. So every time I create a new to-do, it starts at false, and it has some content inside. And then I just set state, and I basically I add the new to-do to the beginning of my array, and I spread the rest of the array. Right? So this is the effect. So every time I call add to-do, a to-do comes at the beginning of the array, at the top. Pretty cool? Nothing special, really. This is just React so far. Then complete to-do is going to do, basically, it's going to grab my array of to-dos. It's going to find the to-do by ID, and it's going to change the completed property from false to true. I said complete to-do, but it's sort of toggling, right? So if it's true, it will be false. If it's false, it will be true. That's why if I click on it once, it's completed. If I click on it again, it's uncompleted. Right? We do that with a little bang. Finally, deleting a to-do is just filtering, right? So if we have an array of 100 to-dos and I pass you an ID, you will find the ID, take it out of the list, give me back a new list minus that to-do. So that happens when I double click. Yep. Any questions about the app so far? Great. So another thing about this app is that when the app loads, so on componented mount, that means only when the page loads for the first time, or this component appears for the first time, I want to run some code. Right? And the code I'm running is getting some to-dos. You see all that stuff? That's basically lorem ipsum, and it comes from this website. This website is like a free dummy API that you can use to get some like fake data. So I'm getting that fake data, and then I am putting that fake data in my to-dos. This is why every time I refresh my app, I'm going to lose the ones I typed because I'm not saving them anywhere. I didn't want to create a whole database for this. But I am getting all the to-dos back from the API. Right? And notice that this only happens once. Yeah.
Some of them are already complete.
Because it's part of the API.
They come with the complete.
Yeah, yeah. So if you look at the API, the API literally just gives me to-dos. Some of them are completed. Can you still read if I minimize it like this? Cool. Then this is very simple. I have a title component. I created a little form in a different component that it basically just is this input here. And when I type stuff, it will keep state of like what am I typing, and when I press enter, it's going to call this add to do function to add a new to do. And finally then I have a to-dos component that contains all of my to-dos, right? So I am passing the state, and I'm also passing the complete to-do and the delete to-do. So each to-do can complete itself or delete itself. Yes?
Why is your on click?
So this right now I'm just passing stuff as props to components, right?
Yeah.
So where is this click happening? Well, it's happening in an individual to-do. That means that if I go to the individual to-do, it has on click, handle click, and on double click, handle double click. So it's happening there. And that also answers your question, how can we do something on a double click? That's just basically a React event. You ready to turn this into a function? Let's do it. So again, the way to do it would be, first of all, turn the whole thing into a function that takes props and returns some HTML. Now this syntax is not going to be valid anymore for a while. So let's stop that for a second. I think also this, none of this will be good. We don't need a render function. We don't need a render function. And also, we don't have access to this anymore because this is just a function now, right? So we need to create our own app to do, and we're going to have to create our own to-dos, right? So for now, we don't have any of this. And it's breaking because I'm trying to map over to-dos and it doesn't work. Right? Because it's expecting to-dos somewhere down the line in my to-dos component. It's expecting to-dos to be an array. I'm trying to map over it, and now I am passing undefined. If I pass an empty array, it's going to work. But obviously, I don't want to just pass hardcode an empty array here. I want to have some state. So the first thing I need to do is replicate my state. Right, so in here, we said state is just a list of to-dos, and the initial value is an empty array. So how do we fix this now? We need to have use state. And to have use state, we need to import it first. So use state from here. What's our initial state? It's an empty array, right? Like this. And remember, this returns an array with the getter and the setter. So I'm going to destructure that array, and the getter is going to be my to-dos, right? And set to-dos.
So the question was, is it convention to always name the set or set the name of the getter?
Yeah. You can call it whatever, but it makes sense to call it, this is to-dos, that's set to-dos. It's kind of the symmetry of it, right?
No, I get it, but I'm curious whether it's become already a book's convention.
It's pretty much a convention, yeah. That would work too. Great, so I got rid of that. I replicated that behavior now. And you can see that it's working because if I pass my to-dos here, my app doesn't crash. So to-dos must be an array, right? It's working. What's missing now? So, okay, let's do the component.mount bit first. So we can actually see some to-dos on the page, because otherwise it's a bit boring. Right, so now the app is loading, but nothing's happening. We just have an empty array and there's nothing else. Actually, let's not do that. Let's finish this first. So we can actually still add to-dos, right? And we can work with this. So all of this stuff really, adding a to-do, completing a to-do, and deleting a to-do, it has nothing to do with lifecycle methods yet. This is just state. So we can fix our functions, right? So very easily, we can now turn this method we had into a function that will use these two things. Right? So what do I need to change to make add to do work? So first, I need to actually say this is a const because we're inside a function now. So I'm creating a new function. What's wrong about this inside? We don't have a class anymore, so this.setState has to go. What do we replace it with? So set to-dos, right? And the way set to-dos work is simpler because we don't need to say, we don't need to pass an object anymore, and we don't need to say which key we're trying to change like we did with setState. It's literally, this is going to change that. What are we changing it to? Well, I'm going to change it to the same thing I was changing it before. An array with the new to-do at the beginning and the rest of the to-dos at the end. It's still no state. So becomes much cleaner. Right? I can read to-dos and I can read set to-dos from here because everything is written inside this app function. Because of scope, this function can read this. So I forgot to pass it down now. Right? So what's actually happening is we're calling out to do, which is this function here. And out to do is updating our state. And because we're passing the state down, the state is syncing for us. And everything's updated, just like before. Only without all this set state, this dot set state, this dot state dot, this dot state dot, this dot prop stuff. That works. Let's fix the other two as well. So to fix this one, again, I need to put a const because I'm actually just creating a function now. And set state doesn't exist. I don't need any of this. I can replace all of this with set to-dos, new to-dos. And again, whatever you see this.state, we don't need that anymore. We can refer to to-dos directly. And let's fix this one too. We can do that, and then again this becomes very, very easy because we don't need an object anymore, and we don't need this.setState, which just says set to-dos. So now all that's missing is passing things to the right thing, delete, do.
If you do accidentally have this .set state sort of thing, but it's using the same syntax as the to do, will React know that you're what you're trying to do?
There's no set state, doesn't exist. The this keyword doesn't exist here. If you use the this keyword here, the this keyword refers to window, which doesn't make any sense. So we basically, this .set state is not a thing anymore. This .set state is just a method of React class components. These components are functions, they don't have this .set state. Any questions so far? So we managed to basically refactor all our state functionality, right? So we can now add to-dos, we can complete to-dos, and we can delete to-dos. What we don't have yet is our lifecycle functionality. So at the beginning of the app, what we were doing is fetching data from an API. I still want to do that, but I only want to do it once, and I need to figure out a way to do it. Because I could technically, I could do this, and I could say, set my to-dos, right? So I just created a function, and I could literally just call it in here. But what do you think is going to happen if I call it in here? So let's take a look at this, and let's say get to-dos. I'm going to add a little console log somewhere here as well. So that's the cool thing about functions, right? We can write code. Before we couldn't do that in classes. Now we can write any code here. I'm going to say console log props. So app props. Yeah, we have props. Oh, we don't need props. Huh? So where's the error? So
No, not to that error, but saying you're missing a greater than line 38.
oh, I'm missing the, yeah. And even then, right, it's still not on. You see this? You see that? Not good. Okay. So we could do that, but then it's just going to happen every time the app renders, right? And because every time we render, we're setting new to-dos, it renders again, and then it renders again, and it renders again. So we're basically doing an infinite loop. So use effect is what will help us from doing this, right? So I actually do it just once, like we wanted to. Before we were using component mount. So component mount is this magical method that React knows about, and it only calls once when the app loads, when my component shows for the first time. Now I want to get the same functionality as this, but I want to do it without a lifecycle methods because we don't have those anymore. So what React gives us is use effect. Quick look, how do we use effect? Well, we need to just call use effect, pass the function that we want to run, and then the dependencies. So there's a little trick here. I'm just going to say app rendered, because I don't really need to know about the to-dos. So you can see app is rendering just once. So remember the syntax. First thing is the function I want. Second thing is the dependencies. So the function I'm trying to run is that. And my dependencies well, I don't really have any, or I don't want this to trigger ever again. I just want it to happen the first time, and I want it to happen never again. So I'm trying to mimic my component did mount, right? So use effect by default, if I don't pass any dependencies at all, as in if I don't pass this argument, it's actually going to be stuck in a re-render. So it's going to trigger my effect every single time. So it's doing the same that we were doing before. But if I pass an empty array, I'll need to restart the app, I think, because it's kind of stuck. Give it a second. Sure. Infinite loops. Is this working? Come on. Yeah, okay. That was fun. You got it? Are you sending it to me? Thank you. So we did everything up to here, right? Ah, okay, so you're doing that there. Set to do. So what did you get up to here? It's basically the same. Ah. Okay. Sorry about that. Back to the scene of the crime. So he did it slightly differently. So what he's doing is he created this set to-dos that will already set my to-dos. Right? So it's doing both things. It's fetching the to-dos and it's also setting them. And then I'm actually just creating an empty function here that will call get to-dos. So that will get them and that will change the state for me. Now, the empty array, what it tells me is I'm explicitly saying there are no dependencies, which means there's nothing to compare. Don't run it again. Just run it one time. Because there's nothing that will change that will trigger a new re-render. Right? So just trigger my effect when my component renders for the first time and never again. Yeah?
If you add a new one now,
Yeah.
do you not have to re-render it?
So the component will re-render, but the effect won't re-trigger.
Will we trigger once?
It will only trigger. It will only trigger on mount. So
No, so an empty array basically turns into a value mount.
mm,
No parameter turns into a component. We'll update it.
kind of.
So is it an array of booleans then, like things that evaluate to true or false? So it'd be like
No, it's an array of values, right? So if you have 0, and the next time you compare it, 0 is 0, then it won't, like this is the same, I won't trigger the effect again. But if you had 0 and the next time it re-renders is a 1, 0 is not 1.
previous,
It compares the previous
like shallow thing.
value that's in here, yeah. So it's a shadow comparison. But when I say there's nothing to compare, I'm saying I don't want to re-trigger this ever again, just the first time. So my app will re-render, but when it re-renders, the effect is going to check, is there anything to compare? No? Okay, I won't trigger then, it's fine. I already done this effect. So now this is kind of mimicking component map. And yes, if you remove this, it's going to be mimicking like component. It's actually going to be doing component did mount and component did update at the same time. It's going to be doing everything. So the right way to think about this is it's not really mimicking the lifecycle methods before. It's just running an effect, and you can tell it to run all the time, or sometimes, or if you put an empty array, it's saying just once at the beginning.
So React has an internal counter, so it knows when it's mounting once, but don't mount it knows how many times.
Yeah, so it's going to run this. It's going to run this function once, and it's going to check the value that's in here. Then it's going to run the function twice, the second time, and it's going to check the current value here towards the previous value that was there when we render the first time. And if it's different, it will trigger the effect again. And if it's the same, it won't. In this case, there's nothing, so it will never re-trigger. It just triggers once.
How do you make a component will unmount?
We'll see in a minute. But are you following so far? So right now we got to the point in which we have a full to-do app, exactly the way it was before, right? So when the app loads, I am rendering the app, and I am fetching my to-dos. I am setting my to-do array to the new to-dos I got from the server, and then every time I add something new, it comes and goes. It's there. So this is behaving exactly the same way the class component was behaving before, right? Yeah? If you have a question about this, now's the time. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to the real meat of this show. Do you want to have a break? Most people said no. Well, I think we're at 3/4 there. Cool. So now we know how to use useState and how to use useEffect. And these two things combined basically give us pretty much everything we need to write functions instead of classes, right? So we can replace state and we can replace lifecycle methods. Now, the real benefit of this is great and it's cool, but you remember the motivation? So one of the motivations was it's really hard to reuse stateful logic. So when you have a class component that you have like methods that set state, how do you share this method that sets state with a different component to do the same somewhere else? You can't, right? It's really hard. It's very static. The ways to do it is to create higher order component, render props. So if you remember like with router and all that stuff, it's not as easy, right? So you need to do a lot of advanced techniques. Well, now you will see that we can actually build our own hooks. And we can write them in a completely separate file. And we can just import it into this file and it will work. So we can give stateful logic to that component and also to any other component that wants the same logic. So they will each have a different one, but they will share the same logic. So to do that, I just first want to go through a couple of rules. Very simple. You can only call hooks at the top level. That means don't call hooks inside loops, conditions, or nested functions. And there's a very good reason for this. Is if you think about it, when we're doing this use state and we put it in an array, well, how do we know when the app renders again that my state was an empty array or whatever my state? But like it's some magic happening behind the scenes, right? It turns out what React is doing is it's actually keeping track of all of these the use states that we ever called, and it's basically imagine that it's pushing them into an array, right? And then the first element was the first time you called use state, and the second element is the second time you called use state, and then when the app re-renders, if all the use states are called in the same order, well, they're going to get the right values, right? So imagine that behind the scenes, React is doing something like it's keeping track of everything in an array. If I call useState once, or it's going to put my empty array here. If I call useState again with a 0, well, the second thing is going to be a 0. If I call useState again with something, The third thing is going to be something. So as long as you call them in the same order every time, as long as this stays consistent, React will know, okay, this initially, the previous value was an empty array. This was 0. This is lala, right? But if you mess with this, then React gets completely confused and you get bugs, right? Because what if I put this in an if statement? Or this one in an if statement? Let's say I put this one in an if, right? And I say if, I don't know, todos length is greater than 0, trigger this function. Well, you can kind of see how React would get completely confused about this. Like imagine that the first time that the app renders, the to-do's length is 0. So we call set use state. So React has now created this little array with all my values. The second time it tries to re-render, it's going to check, okay, you call use state once, the previous value was the empty array. We're not calling this one, we're skipping it. And now we call this one. So it's going to think that the previous value was the 0. So there's a mismatch now. Right? So that's essentially what React is doing for us behind the scenes. It's a little magic. It works really well as long as you follow the rule of only call hooks at the top level. Only call hooks inside your function without ifs, without loops. Right? That will make it consistent. That means that every time you re-render the component, all the use states will be called in exactly the same order as they were before. Is that?
Does React have any error handling at the moment?
It does. It will give you nice. React is pretty good at giving you good errors, right? Only call hooks inside React functions. That means here I'm calling use state, and I'm calling it right there, right? I am inside a React function, so everything works fine. If I try to call it outside, it won't work. So I can only call use state inside my component. Right? And you can see that the messages you get are very comprehensive. Here it works. Yeah? Are we ready to write one of our own? Our first custom hook? You will see the power of this. So if you want to know more info about the rules, you can always follow that link. I'll share this with you later on. And by the way, you can call hooks within other hooks as well. So that's fine. Right? So I can call use state inside a different hook and it works. As long as I call the whole thing inside a component eventually, not outside. Wait, so I'll give you an example of one that I built. So there was some logic I wanted to reuse between a couple of different components. And it's the logic of keeping track of where the mouse is. Right? So if you want to code along, that's your link. Let me quickly explain what I'm doing. So this is a separate file now. It's not any of my components. I wrote it in a completely isolated location. I am getting use state and use effect. I don't really need React because I'm not using any JSX. So this is a hook. And remember, it's okay to use hooks within hooks. So this is fine. So what am I doing? Well, I'm saying the initial state of my hook is going to be an object that has an x of 0 and a y of 0. So I'm basically trying to keep track of the x and y coordinates of the mouse. Right? And now we have x and y. So I'm this structure in here. This is a bit clever, but all I'm doing is, this is going to be my object with x and y. I'm saying, give me the x and y separately, right? So they structure those two things. And then I'm saying set chords. So I can call set chords at any moment and pass it a new object. And this is going to become the new this, right? So this is going to replace that. And x and y are going to become the new x and y. So, this is also a bit clever. So I went a little advanced on this one. But this listener, now I'm using use effect, right? So there's something I want to happen only on mount. So I put a little empty array here. Why only on mount? Because what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be adding a global event listener to my page to listen for when the mouse moves. I obviously don't want to add an event listener every time my app renders. Otherwise, I will end up having millions of listeners on the page. So because I only want to do it once, I fix that by putting an empty array. Now, I create my listener. Remember what listeners take? They take events. Yeah? It's taking an event. So events are really objects, right? And my event actually has a client X and a client Y. If you haven't seen it before, I'll show you in a minute. But I'm destructuring that. And I'm saying destructure client X, but actually name it X. And destructure client Y, but name it Y. And now I'm saying set the new coordinates to be X and Y. So it's a bit of clever manipulation of like variables and destructure in there. But hopefully you see what it's doing. And now this is simple. This is just basic JavaScript. So I'm adding an event listener to the global window. And I'm saying when the mouse moves, call this function. And look at this bit. That answers your question, Gabe. You were asking me before, so how do we write a component will unmount? So it turns out that if we didn't have this line, it would work. But if the component gets unmounted, my listener will still be on the page, trying to set some state that doesn't exist anymore. So you would start to get messages like memory leaks and problems. So the symmetry, when you write a real component, a class component, what you should do, when you add an event listener in the component did mount, you need to remove it in the component will unmount. Because otherwise it stays forever. It lingers on. So effects, you know this little function that we wrote for an effect? Can also return something. They can return a function. And whatever function it returns, it will be called on component will unmount. So what I'm saying is, this is my listener. When my app runs the first time, this code is going to run, not this one. This doesn't matter the first time. So create a listener and attach it to window. And then when my component leaves the page, now call this other function. Remove the listener. I think I need to put mouse move as well. That's a typo. We'll fix it. So we're now going to basically rewrite that ourselves. First I'm going to show you an app. And this app is basically showing you how it works with a class component. So this is now working exactly the way I described it, right? So when I move the mouse, I have an event that's basically setting state every time I move the mouse. It's pretty clever, but nothing new really. So I have state, X and Y. I created a function to update my coordinates. That's going to take an event, and it's going to put the client X inside X and client Y inside Y. And then I'm just going to update my mouse coordinates with that. Finally, remember I told you we attach it in a component did mount. So only when the page loads, we want to attach our listener, not every time it renders, right? That's why we put it in component did mount. And then to fix the bug of like having the event running even after the component leaves the page, in the component will unmount, we need to say remove the listener, mouse move this listener. Yeah? So that should be working. And then I'm just displaying X and Y. So if you think about it, this is a functionality that is potentially quite common. Maybe I want different components to be able to see where the mouse is. But how would you do it right now with classes? How will you share this functionality across all the other components? You would copy and paste it, but you literally need to rewrite it every single time, right? Because I cannot export this function because this function is basically tied to this state here, right? So function and state are sort of very coupled together, and I cannot reuse this logic in different places. I can copy and paste it, but isn't that ugly? We want to keep things dry, right? We want to be able to reuse it. Great. So we're going to rewrite it together. So we've seen it before, and I'm going to rewrite it with you. So I'm going to create a new file, use mouse coordinates. And the first thing I need to do is import use state and use effect from React. Yeah, so I'm going to rebuild it. And I don't need to look at it because the point is we should remember what it's doing. I'm going to call it use mouse chords, and it's going to be a little function. I'm going to export it. And then finally, well, here I need to write what I want to do. And remember, because this is a custom hook that I'm building, I can call other hooks in there. So I can call useState, and I can say, okay, my initial state, remember, it's going to be x0, y0. Because when my app starts, I don't know where the mouse is, so I'm just going to default that to 0. X and y, 0. Now I am getting remember the getter and setter, so these are the chords, and this is set chords. Only, remember what I was doing before? I know the chords is this object, so I can destructure it if I want to. I can say x and y. Or I can leave it like this. I'm actually not sure I need to destructure it anymore. So let's leave it as chords, just the whole object. Yeah. Cool. So now we have state, and that's great. And we can also change the state with set chords. So now I'm going to use effect, because remember what I want to do is I want to trigger an effect only when the component loads for the first time. So to do that, I need to write a function and then an empty array as the second argument to signify that I don't want this to run ever again, just the first time. There are no dependencies. Yeah? And in here I can write my logic. So my logic is, I could write it like this. I could say window, add event listener, mouse move, and then I can write my function here, but there's a problem with this. When I want to remove my listener, I need to be able to pass the same function to the remove. So if I write it here, this is an anonymous function, and now I lost access to it. That's why I wrote the listener before. Right? I write it here. So listener is a function that takes an event, and then it's just going to call, so set chords, and x is going to be event. Let me move here below. And y is going to be event client y. Now all I have to do is pass the listener, right? Because the event listener is going to pass the event. My listener is waiting for the event, and it's going to grab the client X and the client Y from it to update this. Only the first time. I mean, only the first time attach the listener. But now the listener will actually run every time the mouse moves. Every time the mouse. Mouse. Go on, Nico, you can do better than that. Every time the mouse moves. Thanks, Gabe. Yeah? What we're missing was that component will unmount functionality. So what the React team decided to do is, remember how we do it? We can return a function, and this function will trigger when the component unmounts. The reason they did it this way is because before, if you think about it, our logic was basically mixed in different places. So the state is here, the mount is here, and the unmount is here. And it's like, you need to find out what's actually going on, you need to look at 3 different places, right? Whereas they wanted to have everything in one neat little place. Because it kind of goes together, right? We add it here, we remove it here. So to remove, we can say remove event listener mouse move listener, right? So if you pass the same function, JavaScript will find it and it will remove it from the current listener. So the only thing that's missing is now when I call use mouse chords in my component, I want to be able to see my chords. So every time this function runs, it's going to return the current value of my coordinates. So initially it's going to return 0, 0, and then every time I move the mouse, that's going to change, that's going to change, it's going to give me the new ones. So now all of the logic that I had before split into like God knows how many things is now tightly in a single place. And I can import this use mouse chords in 100 different components, and all my components can now see the current chords of the mouse very easily. How do we do it? Well, let's change this now. Let's fix it. So I'm going to turn all this whole thing now into a functional component because we don't need this anymore. I don't need that. I can just say app props, get rid of the render. We have this. This doesn't exist anymore. And this doesn't exist anymore. So now this is kind of working, right? It's a very simple component. It's not doing anything yet. Before I would have had to write all of that logic in there. I don't want to do that. All I have to do now is import use mouse chords from use mouse chords. And I can just call it here. And I can say const chords. Remember, this is what the function returns. It returns the new coordinates. Use mouse chords. Doesn't even need an argument. I could say chords x, chords y. So look how simple my component became, right? So the real power of hooks is this. Yeah, we can replace state. Yeah, we can replace lifecycle methods. But the power is we can reuse all of that logic across all our components. We can write our logic separately now and tightly coupled with each other. So adding a listener, removing a listener, everything is in one nice little place. And we can just sprinkle new functionality to all our functional components by calling custom hooks like this. Right? So if I now created a new app or a new counter or whatever I want to do, I could just import mouse chord, use it like this, and boom, I have access to mouse chords everywhere. Isn't that cool? If you want to make it slightly better, because this is returning an object, we can get x and y. So now I can just pass x and pass y. Who thinks this is cleaner? Yeah? Cool. Any questions?
In the hook,
Yeah.
are you able to just run? Sorry, if you go into the use mouse tools.js. So on like the unmount section and the mounting section, you just have as many sort of constant functions.
Yeah, you can have anything you want. You're just writing stuff inside a function. What matters is that this will only trigger twice. It will trigger this code on mount, and it will trigger this code on unmount. And later on, when you start playing with it, you'll start looking at when do you need to add dependencies? When do you want to trigger things at different times? But for now, it's beyond the scope of this intro to hooks. But how are you feeling about hooks? Do you like them?
Cool.
So if we summarize it, hooks allow you to take a functional component and use some of the abilities of classes, like state, etc., and combine or logic among basically as many.
So yeah, so it replaces everything that the classes can do, and it gives us the superpower of being able to actually write this somewhere else and reuse it.
That's my question is the benefit of using functional components with hooks versus turning that functional component into a class component that you can
Reuse. Yep. There is, but it's more advanced. You need to use higher order components. You need to create extra components. Have you ever, when you use like React Router and all that stuff? What's actually happening, when you try to explore your React DevTools, you have component inside component you didn't even create. It's just complete load of crap with like 100 different components that are not even the ones you want. And to get to the one you want, you need to expand. That's a consequence of having to use higher order components, create extra components to wrap other components, right? So there's a lot of advanced stuff going on, and a lot of stuff that it wasn't really ideal. So this should now keep everything cleaner. This is not new. You could reuse stuff before, but it was much uglier, right? And it was much more advanced to do it. This makes it quite simple and clean. Right? I mean, it took us an hour, and now we learn how to do it. So next steps, that's pretty much it for the talk. Head to the hooks intro page. The React docs are really good. I recommend you read them. It'll give you more ideas. You basically can read the same thing I just said now, but written by the React team. Dan Abramov is the creator of Redux. He's also working as a core developer for Facebook. He writes a blog called overreacted.io. If you haven't seen it yet, he goes into a lot of details about how React keeps state internally and how hooks work and all that stuff. So if you want to like a more advanced read about React, this is a very good place to go. There's an awesome website before even hooks came out officially called Use Hooks. And well, they haven't published new hooks in a while, but almost every day they will publish a new hook. These are custom hooks that people built for us. So you can sign up and get emails, and it will tell you. So for example, it creates this "Why did you update?" So somebody created this hook. By the way, all hooks by convention, they need to start with use. The word use, right? Use state, use courts, use this, and it's important because there's a linter that will check for this and complain otherwise. This custom hook, for example, is able to tell you why a component updated. Did it update because it got new props? Did it update because it got new state? What happened? Right? That's quite cool. You could literally just copy it and use it. This is your hook. You have this one, use dark mode. You know that now operating systems can have like dark mode selected. So this use dark mode will tell you if dark mode is true or false. So you can change your theme based on the user preference. Right? So use media. You can use stuff like media queries through here. So you can make different styling for your components depending on how big the screen is, for example, and stuff like this. You have lock body scroll. Use theme. So if you have a theme in your app, you can basically put all your theme in one place and then sprinkle it across your app using this component. Pretty cool. Use Spring. Spring is an animation framework. It allows you to animate stuff. This makes it easier. History, you can check the history of where you were, like which URLs you went to before. Use script. You can upload like custom scripts. Like you can get jQuery, for example, stuff like this. Like use it in a component with this. Use key press. So you can check, for example, how someone is pressing keys. So if I press the H, this will be true and this will show. If I press the S, this will be true and this will show. At the moment I drop the S, it will stop showing. It's quite cool. I don't know if there's an example there, like a website. So let's see. Come on. Right? So if I press H, it recognizes as an H and it shows me that. If I press H and S and R and F, and this is a hook. Look how easy it is to use. Just import it, call it like this, boom, all this functionality, you didn't have to write it. So the real benefit of this is not just that we can reuse the logic, right? But that we can reuse someone else's logic. This is now basically libraries for React hooks, right? If you want to use a custom logic, someone else probably wrote it, find it online, copy that hook, use it. There will probably be at some point like an npm for hooks, where you can literally say npm install use keypress, right? And then just reuse it. So this now became a shop of functionality that we can share, not just between our components, but between our developers, right? Between the community, everyone can share logic. Isn't that exciting? People are really pumped about hooks, and they're really excited, and they're writing more and more hooks. I have some colleagues that, well, not colleagues, but I have some people on a different server that I go to for like a podcast, and they're writing custom hooks like every day, and they wrote one for like use try, which allows you to do like a very effective like search for like millions of strings in like almost no time. So what people are doing with hooks is amazing, and the fact that it's just so easy to reuse is just super. So that's the real superpower of hooks. It doesn't really do anything new, but it makes it so much easier, and it enables us to share, to reuse our logic in a much, much better way. And finally, hooks are available today. If you download the latest version of Create React app, it will install with React 16.8, which has hooks. So today, even in production code, you could start writing components with hooks instead of classes. Anyone else? Questions? It's pretty cool, isn't it? I was a bit hesitant at first, all the magic that's happening and stuff, but the more I use it, the more I go like, this is just mind-blowing. Mind-blowingly easy once you get used to it. And mind-blowingly easy to share what you've used with someone else and with other components. Beautiful. Thank you.